You think Ron Howard is the calmest man in Hollywood? The gentle director everyone trusts? But no. Behind that soft voice and quiet smile, he has a secret list of 7 stars he swears he never wants to work with again. They are Ron Howard's friends, mentors, even heroes. They helped him win Oscars, then destroyed everything he built in his career. Before revealing the list of 7 stars that even the nicest man in Hollywood learned to hate, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're coming from in the comments. First, there's Russell Crowe, the fiery genius who broke Ron Howard's calm. Ron used to say that Cinderella Man was the hardest film he ever made, and the reason had a name, Russell Crowe. From the very first day, their partnership felt like a ticking bomb. Crowe didn't walk on set like an actor. He came in like a general marching into war. He wanted control. He wanted command. He wanted confrontation. And those were the exact things Ron Howard always tried to avoid. Back when they worked together on A Beautiful Mind, they already had quiet creative clashes. But in 2004, on Cinderella Man, that quiet tension finally exploded. Crowe challenged everything: the lighting, the pacing, even where the camera should stand. In the middle of a brutal boxing scene, he suddenly stopped and yelled across the ring that Ron didn't understand the pain of the character. The whole set froze. For a few seconds, nobody even breathed. Ron just stood there, calm on the outside, furious on the inside. After that day, people whispered that it felt like watching two giants trying to outwill each other. Each week, the set got heavier, more tense. Crowe wanted to reshoot long scenes because he said the emotion wasn't real enough. Howard was fighting to keep the schedule from falling apart. Their energy became toxic. Late one night, Ron told the producers that working with Crowe felt like riding a bull while trying to build a church. Everyone who heard that line nodded. They knew exactly what he meant. Even after the movie came out and got great reviews, Ron refused to work with him again. Reporters kept asking if they'd ever team up for another project. His answer never changed. One time was enough. Crowe later admitted their styles were just too different to ever blend. On paper, they looked perfect together. Ron was calm, methodical, the quiet type. Crowe was fire, instinct, raw emotion. But when calm meets fire, somebody always gets burned. By the third week, the budget was bleeding. $2 million every week just to keep production alive. Universal sent in more people to control the chaos, but no one could fix what was already broken. The crew walked on eggshells. They moved slower, spoke softer, avoided eye contact. Everyone felt it. Ron never raised his voice. Not once. He just kept directing, holding everything together with his pure patience. But by the end, he looked different, older, thinner, worn out. The kind of tired that doesn't go away after a weekend off. Still, out of that storm came something powerful. Cinderella Man turned out to be one of the most respected boxing dramas of its time. It earned 3 Oscar nominations, and critics loved it. Every punch you see on screen carries the real tension between them. Every silence between shots feels like the calm before another clash. When people ask Ron Howard which film tested his spirit the most, he doesn't talk about budgets or critics. He just says, Cinderella Man. Because behind every masterpiece, there's a war no one sees. Behind every calm voice, there's a fire trying not to explode. 2 men, both brilliant, both stubborn, pushing each other past the limit. And somehow, out of all that chaos, they created something timeless. That's the thing about Hollywood. Sometimes greatness doesn't come from peace. It comes from 2 storms colliding and refusing to back down. The second person on Ron Howard's secret list was Jim Carrey, the green monster who nearly drove him to the edge. Ron once laughed in an interview and said that how the Grinch stole Christmas almost stole his sanity, but there was more truth in that joke than anyone knew. It was the year 2000, inside the glowing chaos of Universal Studios in Los Angeles. Every soundstage looked like a postcard from Christmas. Snow machines blew white powder across Whoville's candy-colored streets. The lights were bright enough to make anyone smile. But behind the scenes, the magic was slipping away. At the heart of it all was Jim Carrey, wrapped in more than 50 pounds of green latex, fur, and prosthetics. The makeup took 8 hours every single morning, 8 hours of sitting still, unable to move, barely able to breathe. By the third day, the joy that defined Jim Carrey started to crack. He was a man who built his career on freedom, wild improvisation, and total control of the stage. Now he was trapped inside what he called a rubber coffin. He snapped at makeup artists, growled at assistants, and at one point turned that frustration toward Ron himself. The crew learned to stay quiet. One of them later said that working those weeks felt like walking barefoot over glass. Then came the day everyone remembers. They were halfway through a long morning shoot. The lights were hot, the suit was suffocating, and the Grinch was supposed to laugh. Instead, Jim exploded. He ripped off his gloves, stormed out of the set, and disappeared into his trailer. No one said a word. Ron stood still, watching the door close, knowing this wasn't just a bad moment, it was a breaking point. Universal executives were terrified. They were spending more than $150 million on the film, and their star was threatening to quit. The studio called emergency meetings. Ron called for patience, but patience was wearing thin. That's when they brought in help, a man who had nothing to do with Hollywood, a Navy SEAL survival expert, someone who trained soldiers to endure torture. His new mission was to teach Jim Carrey how to survive the costume. He taught him breathing tricks, ways to control panic, even moments of meditation between takes. Slowly, the storm inside Jim started to settle. When he returned to set, things improved, but only a little. Jim still improvised whole scenes without warning. He changed dialogue mid-shot. Sometimes he just froze, staring through the layers of makeup like he wasn't really there. Ron adjusted as best he could, rewriting blocking, moving cameras, anything to keep the story alive. Weeks turned into months. The schedule stretched. The budget grew heavier. By the 10th week, the set looked perfect, but the people looked broken. Crew members worked 16-hour days, and every night Ron went home drained. His calm demeanor never cracked, but the exhaustion showed in every photo. Still, he refused to give up. He told the crew that if they could just get through this, they might make something timeless. And somehow they did. When the film finally opened in December 2000, it exploded across the box office. It made more than $340 million worldwide. Families loved it. Kids laughed. Critics called it strange but unforgettable. For the audience, it was a Christmas miracle. For Ron, it was survival. When reporters later asked him about the experience, he smiled politely and said that Jim brought incredible energy to the role, but those close to him knew that behind that calm smile was a director who had been pushed past his limits. In private, Ron admitted that the movie had aged him years in just a few months. It wasn't the work that broke him. It was the unpredictability, the daily tension of never knowing what version of his star would walk through the door. But even through all that chaos, Ron never stopped respecting Jim's brilliance. He knew that without that madness, the movie might never have come alive. Because sometimes genius isn't gentle. Sometimes it burns everything around it until only the truth remains. When he looks back today, Ron calls The Grinch both a triumph and a trial. It made him realize that even the calmest man in Hollywood can only stand inside a storm for so long. And to bring a monster to life, sometimes you have to fight one behind the camera too. That's the price of working with brilliance. It can light up the screen and burn you at the same time. The third person on Ron Howard's list was Tom Cruise, the man who turned perfection into war. It is hard to imagine Hollywood's calmest director facing off with the most powerful actor of the early 90s. But that is exactly what happened. It was 1991, and Ron was beginning to film Far and Away, a grand Irish-American epic about love, pride, and survival. At that time, Tom Cruise was unstoppable. Top Gun had made him a national icon. Born on the 4th of July had earned him an Oscar nomination. He wanted his next movie to be even bigger, something that would prove he could carry a film built on heart and heroism. Ron Howard, on the other hand, was known as the quiet craftsman of Hollywood, a man who believed that patience and precision could turn chaos into beauty. On paper, they looked like a dream team. For the first few weeks, it was just that Tom arrived with energy that lit up the set. Nicole Kidman, his co-star and partner, brought elegance and calm. Ron admired Tom's commitment, his preparation, his drive. But that drive soon turned into something else. Tom was chasing perfection in every single frame. He wanted emotion that felt real, not rehearsed. He wanted his character to bleed, to fight, to explode with feeling. Ron wanted something different. He wanted control, balance, and rhythm. To him, filmmaking was like conducting an orchestra. Every sound had to fit. Every moment had to breathe. Their visions started to collide quietly at first, then louder with each day. It all came to a head on a cold afternoon in Dublin. The sky was gray, the rain never stopped, and the crew had been filming for 10 straight hours. In the middle of a take, Tom stopped suddenly. He threw down his gloves, soaked and furious, and said the scene did not feel real. The crew froze. Ron looked up from behind the monitor, calm but firm, and said softly that real was not about noise. Tom. That silence that followed was heavier than thunder. From that moment, something between them cracked. Tom started challenging direction, changing movement, rewriting pieces of dialogue. He wanted to chase emotion until it hurt. Ron quietly began filming extra angles, just in case he needed to piece things together later. Nicole Kidman tried to keep the peace, but the tension never went away. The crew said it felt like walking through a minefield. Every step could set something off. By the 6th week, everything was behind schedule. The Irish rain ruined equipment. The mud swallowed set pieces, and the budget climbed past $60 million. Studio executives called every day asking for updates. But for Ron, the real struggle was not the weather or the money. It was holding the story together while two creative storms pulled in opposite directions. One night, long after filming wrapped for the day, Ron sat alone watching playback. He saw Tom's face on the screen, the intensity, the emotion, the unfiltered fire. He realized that even though the process had been painful, it was also strangely beautiful. Their tension had seeped into the film, giving it life and soul. When Far and Away was released in 1992, audiences were divided. Some loved the scale and the romance. Others said it felt uneven. What they did not know was that the unevenness came from the very battle that created it. The movie carried their conflict like a scar. Reporters asked Ron if he would ever work with Tom again. He gave that calm smile that everyone knew and said that some people confuse passion with cal. It was polite, but it said everything. There was never a public fight, never bad words between them, only distance. Tom went on to make A Few Good Men and Mission Impossible. Ron kept building his legacy with films that balanced emotion and order, but Far and Away stayed with both of them. For Ron, it was a lesson in humility. No matter how much control a director has, he cannot control a force of nature. For Tom, it was a lesson in trust, that sometimes silence can speak louder than fire. When people ask Ron today which film tested him the most, he often mentions Far and Away. Not because it was a failure, but because it taught him something about balance. He learned that perfection without peace becomes war, and that two brilliant visions can be too strong to share the same screen. In the end, their clash was not about ego. It was about passion. And sometimes, passion burns too bright to last. Because in Hollywood, not every storm ends in destruction. Some end in quiet respect, with two men walking away, each knowing they gave everything they had. The fourth person on Ron Howard's list was Mel Gibson, the star who turned a collaboration into a battlefield. Ron once said that working with Mel on Ransom was like steering a ship through a storm with lightning hitting from every side. And in 1996, that storm almost sank them both. At that time, Mel Gibson was untouchable. He had just won 2 Oscars for Braveheart and was at the height of his fame. Every studio wanted him. Every director wanted to work with him. Ron Howard thought he was hiring a professional. What he got instead was a challenge unlike any he had faced before. From the start, there was friction. Ransom was a tense thriller about a father whose son is kidnapped, a story built on precision, control, and emotional restraint. But Mel wanted chaos. He wanted to make it feel raw and unpredictable. He believed truth came from breaking rules. Ron believed truth came from discipline. On the first week of shooting in New York, Mel began questioning the lighting setups, the camera placement, even small pieces of dialogue. He wanted to change everything, constantly chasing a new sense of realism. Ron, known for his calm order, tried to compromise, but every day became a tug of war. The crew could feel it. One camera operator said it was like watching two captains try to steer the same ship. Some days Mel would walk on set with an idea that completely rewrote a scene. Other days he would refuse to do multiple takes, claiming that the first one was the only one that felt true. The tension finally boiled over during a night shoot. They were filming a critical scene where Mel's character was supposed to break down after a ransom call. The atmosphere was thick, the lights low, everyone waiting for a perfect take. Mel stopped halfway through and shouted that the script did not understand what a father would feel in that moment. He slammed the pages down on a table and told Ron to rewrite it right there. Ron stayed silent for a long moment, then spoke quietly. He said that Mel might know what the audience wanted, but he was not the director of this film. The set went still. You could hear the buzz of the lights. From that night on, every day felt like walking on thin ice. Mel's energy was unpredictable. One day he was charming, joking with the crew. The next he was furious, changing lines mid-shot, pacing behind the monitors. Ron adapted. He began shooting backup angles secretly, making sure he had options in the editing room in case the performances fell apart. The stress spread quickly. Universal executives visited the set twice to check on progress. Schedules slipped, tempers frayed, and the crew whispered that the movie was slowly breaking everyone involved. But somehow, Ron never lost control. He kept his voice calm, his notes clear, his focus steady. When filming finally wrapped, both men were drained. Mel disappeared from the wrap party early, exhausted but still proud of the work. Ron sat quietly in a corner, watching the crew celebrate, knowing the film they had made had cost them both more than they expected. When Ransom hit theaters later that year, it became a success. The movie earned more than $300 million worldwide and was praised for its tension and emotional power. Critics called it one of Mel Gibson's best performances. But few people knew what it took to get there. Behind every frame was a clash of wills. In interviews, Mel complimented Ron's direction but never mentioned his name again. Ron called the project one of the most draining of his life. The experience taught him that even the greatest talent can become a storm if not guided carefully. Years later, when Ron talked about that time, he said that Ransom proved something important to him. You can respect a genius without wanting to work with him again. It was not about anger or ego. It was about survival. Because sometimes, in the pursuit of art, even calm men must face tempests that test every ounce of their patience. In the end, Ransom was both a triumph and a warning. It showed that passion without boundaries can tear through even the strongest collaboration. And that the hardest part of being a director is not managing the cameras or the money. It is managing the fire inside the people who make the magic happen. Mel Gibson gave Ron Howard one of his best films and one of his hardest lessons. That genius can light up a scene, but it can also burn through everything around it. And that is how Ransom was made, through brilliance, conflict, and the quiet endurance of a man who refused to lose his calm no matter how fierce the storm became. The fifth person on Ron Howard's list was Marlon Brando, the Hollywood god who turned into a nightmare. For decades, Brando had been the symbol of pure acting genius, the man who changed cinema forever with A Streetcar Named Desire and The Godfather. He was untouchable, unpredictable, and unstoppable. So when Ron Howard finally had a chance to work with him in the mid-1990s, it felt like destiny. The calmest man in Hollywood was about to collaborate with its wildest legend. The project was small, an experimental drama that never reached the screen. But from the very first day, Ron realized that this was not going to be an ordinary experience. Brando arrived on set late, already irritated, wearing sunglasses inside the studio, and holding a script he clearly had not read. He glanced at it once, shrugged, and said that he preferred to improvise. Ron tried to keep things gentle. He offered to walk through the scenes to talk about motivation and structure. Brando waved him off. He said he did not memorize lines anymore. He preferred to feel them. Soon, the crew learned what that meant. Instead of studying his dialogue, Brando had the words printed in large letters and taped all around the set, on walls, on props, even on the backs of other actors. The first few takes were chaotic but somehow brilliant. Brando's instincts were wild but captivating. Then the chaos grew. Some days he refused to come out of his trailer. Other days he showed up hours late, changed his lines completely, and asked the camera team to follow him without warning. The schedule started collapsing. The budget was bleeding. One afternoon, they were shooting a quiet, emotional scene. The set was silent. Cameras were rolling. Halfway through, Brando stopped and said the dialogue was garbage. He told Ron to rewrite it right then and there. Ron tried to reason with him, explaining that the lines connected to other scenes, but Brando just smiled, walked away, and disappeared for the rest of the day. When he came back 3 hours later, he decided his character should now have a different accent. No one knew why. The other actors struggled to keep up. The sound team tried to hide their frustration. Ron, usually calm as a monk, started to lose his patience. In private, he told one of the producers that this was not acting. It was sabotage. The next morning, Brando ignored the call sheet completely and showed up wearing a different costume he had picked out himself. The costume designer nearly cried. It became clear that no amount of planning could control him. The studio started to panic. Weeks went by with little usable footage. What was supposed to be a 3-month shoot had already stretched into 5. Everyone was exhausted, confused, and afraid to confront the legend. Finally, after a particularly disastrous day, Ron called a private meeting. He told the producers that the project could not go on. Brando's unpredictability had destroyed any chance of finishing on schedule. 2 days later, the entire production shut down. For Ron, it was humiliating. He had dreamed of working with Marlon Brando since he was a kid watching The Godfather. He wanted to learn from the master. Instead, he found chaos wrapped in genius. Brando never apologized. He simply said that art could not be rushed. Ron never mentioned him publicly again, but those close to him said that experience changed him forever. It taught him that not all legends are meant to be admired up close. The unfinished project quietly disappeared from the studio archives, but the memory stayed with everyone who was there. One crew member said it felt like trying to film a hurricane. You could not control it. You could only survive it. Years later, Ron called that time both heartbreaking and educational. He said that Marlon Brando reminded him that genius is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a curse, both for the person who has it and for everyone around them. The encounter made Ron more careful about who he worked with. He learned that talent without discipline is like a wildfire. It burns bright, but it leaves nothing standing. Marlon Brando remained one of the greatest actors of all time, but to Ron Howard, he was the one who showed him that there is a thin line between brilliance and chaos. In the end, their meeting never produced a movie, but it did produce a lesson. Even the calmest man in Hollywood can only reason with a hurricane for so long. And sometimes, the cost of chasing greatness is realizing that some gods are best admired from afar. The 6th person on Ron Howard's list was Hugh Grant, the polite smile that he simply could not stand. For decades, Hugh Grant had been the face of British charm, a man who could make audiences laugh, cry, and swoon all in the same breath. But behind that polished accent and velvet suit, there was a sharp tongue that not everyone could handle. Their paths crossed in the early 2000s. When Ron was developing a romantic dramedy under Imagine Entertainment, it was supposed to be a mix of heart and humor, a story about second chances and unexpected love. Hugh was one of the names being considered for the lead. On paper, it looked perfect. The studio loved the idea. Ron was curious, and Hollywood was ready to see a collaboration between the American craftsman and the British gentleman. So a meeting was arranged, just a casual lunch between director and actor, but what was meant to be friendly turned sour almost immediately. Hugh arrived late, wearing his usual grin, charming but distant. He sat down, glanced at the script, and within minutes started picking it apart. He said the story was too sentimental, that Americans always needed explosions to feel emotion. The word stung. Ron smiled, as he always did, but inside he felt the air shift. This was not wit. This was arrogance, rawness. Still, he tried to stay calm. He talked about tone, pacing, the balance between humor and honesty. Hugh nodded, half listening, sipping his coffee like he had somewhere better to be. Then he laughed and said that the script needed a British touch to make it clever. The line hung in the air like smoke. The room went quiet. Ron slowly closed his notebook. He looked across the table and said softly that they were probably looking for different things. Hugh paused for a moment, unsure if he had gone too far, but the meeting ended right there. No argument, no drama, just a cold silence that said everything words couldn't. Afterward, Ron walked out and told his producing partner that the project would move forward, but without Hugh Grant, the studio was surprised. They asked if he was sure. Ron said yes. It was not about talent, it was about energy. News traveled fast. In Hollywood, whispers moved quicker than headlines. People started talking about what had happened at that lunch. Some said it was just a misunderstanding. Others said it was proof that two kinds of professionalism could never meet. Whatever the truth was, Ron made up his mind. He never worked with Hugh Grant, not then, not ever. Months later, the film was made with another actor. It did well, earning praise for its warmth and sincerity. When Hugh was asked about it in an interview, he joked that American directors were too earnest for his taste. He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he meant. Ron didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any headline. In private, he told friends that arrogance was more exhausting than chaos. He could handle temper, passion, even madness on set, but not the quiet superiority that poisoned collaboration before it even began. Years later, when the story resurfaced, Ron brushed it off with his usual grace. He said that not every actor fits every story, and sometimes the best decision is the one that saves your peace. But those who knew him said that meeting stayed with him. It reminded him that the worst conflicts aren't always loud. Some are quiet, polite, and perfectly rehearsed. Hugh Grant went on to make more romantic comedies, charming millions, playing the same kind of character people adored him for. Ron Howard went on to direct films that demanded patience, focus, and humility. Their paths never crossed again. Looking back, Ron often said that every difficult encounter teaches a lesson. Russell Crowe taught him endurance. Jim Carrey taught him adaptability. Tom Cruise taught him balance. Mel Gibson taught him discipline. Marlon Brando taught him restraint. And Hugh Grant taught him silence. Because sometimes the most dangerous storm doesn't shout or break things. Sometimes it smiles and tells you how clever it is. And in Hollywood, where everyone wants to be heard, knowing when to walk away quietly can be the most powerful move of all. The seventh person on Ron Howard's list was Chevy Chase, the walking disaster he refused to touch. Unlike the others, Ron never worked with Chevy. He didn't have to. The stories alone were enough. It was the late 1980s, and Universal Studios was planning a big comedy. They wanted a charming, bankable star, someone who could carry both humor and heart. Chevy Chase was at the top of their list. Saturday Night Live, National Lampoon. Fletch, his name still carried weight. So the studio made a call to Ron Howard, hoping he would direct. When Ron heard the name, he didn't even hesitate. He said no before the meeting was ever scheduled. To his producing partner, Brian Grazer, he simply said that he didn't babysit hurricanes. By that time, Chevy's reputation in Hollywood was legendary for all the wrong reasons. He had fought with cast members, insulted writers, and stormed off sets more times than anyone could count. Directors called him unpredictable. Actors called him impossible. Crew members called him something worse. Ron didn't need to see it firsthand. He had built his career on calm, teamwork, and quiet discipline. He knew that creative chaos could sometimes lead to greatness, but toxic energy only poisoned everything around it. So when Universal pushed again, offering more money and promising they could keep Chevy under control, Ron still said no. A few weeks later, at a party in Los Angeles, Chevy heard that Ron had turned him down. He laughed and told people that Howard only worked with nice guys and that must be boring as hell. When the words reached Ron, he smiled and replied softly, "That was exactly the point." It became one of those Hollywood stories that people whispered about for years. Not a feud, not a fight, just a quiet example of two very different men walking different paths. Ron Howard, the director who built his empire on peace and patience. Chevy Chase, the comic genius who thrived on conflict. Years later, when Chevy joined the cast of the show Community, his temper returned to the headlines. He clashed with writers, stormed off sets, and insulted his co-stars. The cycle repeated itself, proving that Ron had been right all along. When asked again if he would ever work with Chevy Chase, Ron's answer was short and clear. Some chaos isn't worth capturing on film. It was the perfect closing line for a man who had spent his life balancing art and order. Ron Howard never needed drama to make great cinema. He needed focus, patience, and people who respected the process. Because in the end, Hollywood is full of storms. The real genius isn't in chasing them. It is in knowing which ones to walk away from. And that is what made Ron Howard different. He was not just the nicest man in Hollywood. He was the one who proved that kindness can be power and silence can be strength. At the end of all these stories, one thing becomes clear. In a world built on fame and chaos, Ron Howard showed that calm is not weakness. It is power. He faced storms, egos, and legends, yet never lost his balance. Every clash, every scar, turned into a lesson about patience, respect, and knowing when to walk away. Maybe that is the real secret of greatness. Not in shouting louder, but in standing still when everything else falls apart. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? I want to know who's sharing this moment with me. Moment with me. Moment with me. Moment with me.